Today we're going to dive into an unbelievable story, a near-death experience that revealed a shocking truth about God, something religions don't want you to know. This account by Zane Calloway will challenge everything you believe and open your mind to new understanding. Stay until the end, because what you hear could change your life forever. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a like to continue receiving content like this. Hello, my name is Zane Calloway. I'm 34 years old, I live in Seattle and work as a therapist. It's kind of ironic when I think about it. I spend my days helping people find meaning in their lives, but I still struggle to understand my own. For a long time, I kept this story with me. It's not something you just bring up in casual conversation, you know, but I think the time has come to share it. When I was 9 years old, something happened that changed my life forever. I had what people call a near-death experience, or NDE, but it wasn't just a typical out-of-body experience or seeing a bright light. What I experienced opened my eyes to a world I didn't even know existed. It's hard to explain and even harder for most people to believe. That's why I've only told a handful of people over the years. I guess I should start by saying that I'm not some religious fanatic or New Age guru. Before this happened, I was just a normal kid growing up in Seattle. My parents, Susan and James, raised me in a fairly typical middle-class home. We weren't particularly religious, but we weren't atheists either. We were just normal, I guess. But after what happened to me, normal kind of went out the window. It's not easy to live with the knowledge I acquired that day. Sometimes I feel like I'm carrying a huge secret that could change the way people see the world, but I can't just let it go. Who would believe me? So I spent years trying to understand all of this. I have read countless books about NDEs, spirituality, and consciousness. I talked to other people who had similar experiences, and slowly, I began to accept that what happened to me was real, even if I can't fully explain it. That's why I decided to become a therapist. I thought maybe if I could help other people find meaning in their lives, I could find some in my own. And in a way that helped. But there's always this part of me that feels different, as if I didn't exactly belong in this world anymore. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to that day in Seattle when I was just a 9-year-old kid playing in my neighbor's yard. That's where it all began. And that's where my old life ended and my new life began. It was a typical Seattle day. Gray skies, light drizzle, the kind of weather that makes you want to curl up with a good book. But I was 9 years old and staying inside wasn't an option. I was at my neighbor's house, the Harris family. They lived 2 streets over from us, and their backyard was like a wonderland for a boy my age. I remember the smell of wet grass and the feel of the mist on my skin as I wandered through their garden. It was then that I saw it, a fig that had fallen from one of the trees. For some reason, I was attracted to him. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand, feeling its soft skin. Then I had an idea. The Harris family had a dog, a German shepherd named Rex. He was generally very friendly, always wagging his tail when he saw me. I thought maybe he would like the fig. So I walked over to where he was lying on the porch. "Hey Rex," I called, holding out the fig. "Want a treat?" That's when everything went wrong. Rex's eyes, they changed. One second he was the same friendly dog he always was. The next, it was like looking into the eyes of a wild animal. Before I could even think about running, he charged at me. I felt his teeth sink into my face and neck. It should have hurt, but strangely, I didn't feel any pain. It was like I was watching this happen to someone else. I could see the blood. There was so much. But it seemed distant, unreal. Somehow I managed to get up and started walking towards my house. I vaguely remember hearing screams all around me, but it all seemed so far away. When I walked through the front door, I saw my parents' faces. My mother screamed, a sound that still echoes in my memory. My father picked me up in his arms and ran to the car. The trip to the hospital is a blur in my mind. I remember lying in the back seat looking at the sky through the car window. The clouds seemed to move in slow motion, and I wondered if this was how people felt when they were dying. When we arrived at the hospital, everything seemed to be happening in slow and fast motion at the same time. I was rushed to the emergency room, doctors and nurses rushing around me, their voices an indistinct ringing in my ears. That's when it happened. Suddenly I was no longer on the stretcher. It was as if I had been pulled out of my body. I could see myself down there, pale and covered in blood, as the doctors worked frantically to save me. It was the strangest feeling I'd ever had, like I was two people at once. I looked around the room and saw my mother leaning against the wall, crying silently as a nurse tried to comfort her. My father was outside, pacing back and forth, running his hands through his hair repeatedly. I wanted to tell them I was fine, that they didn't need to worry, but I couldn't make my voice work. Then I felt a kind of tug. It was as if someone had tied an invisible rope around my waist and was pulling me away from the emergency room. I couldn't resist. One moment I was looking at my body on the stretcher, the next, I was being dragged through a tunnel of bright light. The feeling was indescribable. It was as if I was moving at the speed of light, but at the same time it felt like time had completely stopped. The walls of the tunnel sparkled with colors I had never seen before, colors I don't even know exist in our world. And then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I was in a place, well, place isn't really the right word. It was more like a state of being. Everything around me was light, but not a blinding light. It was soft, welcoming, almost as if the light itself was made of love. That's when I saw the doors. 7 enormous golden doors, each adorned with precious stones of colors I had never seen before. They were magnificent, radiant, and I felt irresistibly drawn to them. Each door seemed to hold an entire universe behind it, and I knew somehow that choosing a door would mean embarking on an incredible journey. But before I could take a step toward any of the doors, I felt a presence beside me. It wasn't a person, not in the sense we normally think of it. It was more like a conscience, an entity of pure light and love. The presence beside me spoke no words, but somehow I could understand it perfectly. It was as if we were communicating directly from mind to mind, or soul to soul. "Welcome, Zane," said the presence, though there was no actual sound. "You arrived earlier than we expected. I wanted to ask a million questions. Where was I? What were those doors? Was I dead?" But before I could ask any of those questions, the presence continued. "You are in a place between worlds, Zane. A place where the veil between the physical and the spiritual is thin. The doors you see are pathways to different realms of existence. Each leads to a different journey, a different experience." I looked at the doors again, marveling at their beauty and the mystery they represented. Part of me longed to open each one, to see what lay beyond. But another part of me was scared. What if I chose the wrong door? What if I couldn't go back? As if reading my thoughts, and perhaps it could, the presence of light spoke again. "Don't be afraid, Zane. There are no wrong choices here. Each path leads to growth and understanding. But..." There was a pause, and I felt a wave of, I'm not sure how to describe it. It was as if the light itself was smiling at me. "But it's not your time to choose, not yet. You have a lot to do in the world you left behind. Your mother needs you, Zane. Your father too. And there are many people you will still help in your life." I felt a pang of disappointment. Part of me wanted to stay there in that place of infinite peace and love. But at the same time, I thought about my mother, my father, my friends. I thought about all the things I still wanted to do, all the experiences I still wanted to have. "When the time is right, you will return," said the presence. "And then you can choose your path. But for now, it's time to go back." Before I could say or think anything, I felt that tug again. The tunnel of light reappeared, and I was being dragged back, passing through those indescribable colors at breakneck speed, and then darkness. The first thing I felt was pain, a sharp, pulsing pain that seemed to involve my entire body. Then came the sound, a steady, rhythmic beeping that I later discovered was the heart monitor. Slowly, very slowly, I opened my eyes. The light of the hospital was blinding after the softness of the other place. I blinked several times trying to focus my vision. Little by little, the room took shape around me. White walls, beeping machines, the characteristic smell of antiseptic. I tried to move, but my body felt too heavy. It was then that I noticed pressure on my hand. Turning my head with difficulty, I saw my mother sitting next to the bed, holding my hand. Her eyes were closed, and I could see the tear tracks on her face. "Mother?" My voice came out as a hoarse whisper. His eyes shot open, wide with surprise and relief. "Zane? Oh my God, Zane." She leaned over me, kissing my forehead, fresh tears running down her face. "You're awake, nurse, doctor, he's awake." Everything got a little confusing after that. Doctors and nurses rushed into the room, checking my vitals, asking questions I could barely process. My father appeared, his face a mix of relief and concern. When we were finally alone again, me, my mother, and my father, I tried to tell them what had happened. About the tunnel of light, the golden doors, the loving presence. But words seemed inadequate. Unable to capture the magnitude of what I had experienced, my parents listened patiently, exchanging looks that I couldn't decipher. I later discovered that I had been in a coma for 3 days. The doctors weren't sure if I would wake up. "It must have been a dream, darling," my mother said gently. "You've been through a lot." But I knew it wasn't a dream. It was more real than anything I had ever experienced. And although I was happy to be back, to be with my family, a part of me longed for that place of peace and love that I had glimpsed. Over the next few days, as I recovered in the hospital, I began to notice strange things. The colors seemed different, more vivid somehow. And sometimes when I looked at people, it seemed like I could see something else, a kind of light around them, pulsing and changing. I didn't know it at the time, but my life had changed forever. The near-death experience wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. In the months following my release from the hospital, I began to realize that something fundamental had changed within me. It wasn't just the physical scars from the dog attack, although those were very visible and took time to heal. It was something deeper, something I couldn't fully explain even to myself, much less to others. The first thing I noticed were the dreams. They became incredibly vivid, almost as real as my near-death experience. Sometimes I dreamed of places I had never seen before, of people I didn't know. And the strangest thing was that occasionally, these dreams seemed to come true. I clearly remember a dream I had about a month after returning home. In it, I saw my teacher, Miss Johnson, crying at his desk. In the dream, I knew she had lost someone important, even though I didn't know who it was. I woke up with a strange feeling, a mix of sadness and urgency. That morning, when I arrived at school, Miss Johnson wasn't there. The principal informed us that she had taken a few days off due to a family emergency. 3 days later, when she came back, her eyes were red and swollen, just like in my dream. We later learned that his mother had passed away unexpectedly. This was just the first of many precognitive dreams I had. At first, I tried to ignore them, convincing myself they were just coincidences. But as they became more frequent and more accurate, it became difficult to deny that something extraordinary was happening. In addition to dreams, I began to notice that I could feel the emotions of those around me in a way I had never experienced before. It was like I could see past the masks people wore, straight to their true feelings. This was both a blessing and a curse. On the one hand, it helped me understand people better and be more empathetic. On the other, it was sometimes overwhelming, especially in crowded places where everyone's emotions seemed to blend into an emotional cacophony. I remember one day about 6 months after my near-death experience when I went to the mall with my parents. As soon as we entered, I was hit by a wave of emotion so intense that I almost fainted. Joy, sadness, anger, anxiety, all of it coming from strangers around me. I had to sit on a bench for a few minutes, breathing deeply and trying to block it all out. My parents were worried, of course. They were already apprehensive about the changes they had noticed in me since the incident. I had become quieter, more introspective. I spent a lot of time alone, drawing or writing in my journal about things that even I didn't fully understand. "Zane, are you okay?" my mother asked, sitting next to me on the mall bench. "You look pale." I wanted to tell her. I wanted to explain about the emotions I could feel, about the dreams I had. But how could I make her understand something that even I didn't fully understand? "I'm fine, Mom," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just a little tired." She looked at me with concern but didn't insist. I think she knew there was something more going on, but didn't know how to approach it. How do you explain to your parents that you can feel people's emotions? How do you make them understand that you dream about the future? It was at that moment, sitting on that mall bench with my worried mother by my side, that I truly realized how much my life had changed. I wasn't the same Zane I was before. The near-death experience had changed me in ways I was still discovering. And that was just the beginning. As the months turned into years, I gradually learned to manage my new skills. It wasn't easy, and there were many moments when I wished I could just go back to being normal. But little by little, with a lot of practice and patience, I began to understand better what was happening to me. Premonitory dreams were the first ones I learned to control. I found that by keeping a dream journal and practicing lucid dreaming techniques, I could not only remember my dreams better, but also direct them in a certain way. Not all dreams were precognitive, of course, but when they were, I began to recognize certain patterns and symbols that helped me interpret what they might mean. As for my ability to feel the emotions of others, that proved to be more of a challenge. At first, it was like I was an emotional sponge, absorbing everything around me without a filter. I had to learn meditation and visualization techniques to create a kind of mental shield. It didn't completely block others' emotions, but it made them more manageable. One of the hardest things to deal with was loneliness. I couldn't just tell people about what was happening to me. Who would believe? Even my parents, who loved me unconditionally, had a hard time understanding. They took me to several psychologists and psychiatrists over the years, concerned about my increasingly introverted and weird behavior. I remember one particular session with Dr. Martinez, a psychiatrist who had been with me for a few years during my teenage years. She was a gentle, middle-aged woman with kind eyes behind thick-rimmed glasses. "Zane," she said in one of our sessions, "you mentioned before that sometimes you feel like you can feel other people's emotions. Can you tell me more about that?" I hesitated. I had already learned to be cautious when talking about my experiences. "It's hard to explain, Dr. Martinez. It's like I can see beyond what people show on the outside. Like I can feel what they're feeling." She looked at me for a moment, her face a mask of professional neutrality. But I could feel his curiosity, mixed with a hint of skepticism. "And how does that make you feel, Zane?" I sighed. How to explain something like this? Sometimes it's amazing. I can understand people in a way I never thought possible, but other times it's overwhelming. Like I'm carrying everyone's emotions in addition to my own. Dr. Martinez made some notes in her notebook. "Zane, have you ever considered that this might be a highly developed form of empathy? Many sensitive people report similar experiences." I knew she was trying to rationalize, find a normal explanation for what I was experiencing. Part of me wanted to scream, to tell her about the near-death experience, about the tunnel of light and the golden doors. But another part knew that would only make her think I was delusional. "Maybe," I replied, opting for the safest route. "I think I've always been an empathetic person." The session continued with Dr. Martinez teaching me techniques for dealing with emotional stress. They were helpful in a way, but they didn't address the true nature of what I was experiencing. It was around this time that I started looking for other people who had near-death experiences. I read books, participated in online forums, and even went to a few support group meetings. It was a relief to discover that I wasn't alone, that there were other people who had gone through similar things. But even among these people, my experience felt unique. Most talked about a feeling of peace, of seeing a light at the end of a tunnel. Few mentioned the skills I had subsequently developed. It made me question, why me? What was different about my experience? These questions would stay with me for many years, shaping my search for answers and, eventually, my career choice. But at that moment I was just a teenager trying to navigate a world that had become infinitely more complex and mysterious. When I was 16, something happened that almost exposed my situation to the whole world. It was during my sophomore year of high school, on a day that seemed like any other. I was sitting in history class, a little bored, doodling in my notebook while Mr. Thompson talked about the French Revolution. Suddenly, I felt a wave of panic so intense that I almost fell out of my chair. I looked around, looking for the source, and my eyes fell on Sarah, a quiet girl who sat 2 rows in front of me. Sarah was perfectly still, staring straight ahead, but I could feel the terror emanating from her. Without thinking, I stood up abruptly, interrupting the class. "Sarah," I said, my voice shaking a little, "are you okay?" All eyes turned to me, including Sarah's. She looked at me with a mixture of surprise and relief. "Mr. Calloway," Mr. Thompson said, clearly irritated by the interruption, "is there a problem?" I hesitated. How do I explain what I was feeling without sounding completely crazy? I don't think Sarah's feeling well, sir." At that moment, Sarah began to visibly tremble. Tears began to stream down her face and she let out a strangled sob. What happened next was a blur. Sarah had what we later discovered was a severe panic attack. Paramedics were called, class was interrupted, and I stood there feeling relieved to have helped but also terrified of the questions that were sure to come. And they came. The director called me into his office later that day. "Zane," he said, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and concern. "How did you know Sarah was having trouble? From what I understand, she hadn't shown any visible signs of distress before you spoke." I swallowed hard, my brain working furiously to come up with a plausible explanation. I noticed she seemed tense," I lied. "I think I'm good at reading body language." The director studied me for a long moment. I could feel his distrust, but also his reluctance to push too hard. After all, I had helped a classmate. "Well," he said finally, "whatever it was, you did good today, Zane. Sarah probably needs more help than we realized. Thanks for paying attention." I left the office feeling relieved, but also guilty for having lied. More than that, he was scared. The incident had shown me how powerful and potentially dangerous my abilities could be. That night, lying in bed, I reflected on what had happened. I had helped Sarah, yes, but what if next time I misinterpreted what I was feeling? What if I exposed someone who didn't want to be exposed? It was at that moment that I made a decision that would shape the rest of my life. I would use these skills to help people, but I would have to be very, very careful about how I did it. Little did I know that this decision would take me on a journey I could never have imagined. As I approached the end of high school, the question of career began to weigh heavily on my mind. What could I do that would allow me to use my unique skills to help people without raising too much suspicion? I thought about medicine for a while. After all, being able to feel what patients were feeling would be an incredible advantage for a doctor. But the idea of constantly being surrounded by sick and injured people, absorbing their suffering, was too much for me to bear. It was during a session with Dr. Martinez, yes, I still saw her occasionally, that the idea began to form. "Zane," she said, "have you ever considered becoming a therapist?" The suggestion took me by surprise. "A therapist? Like you?" She smiled. "Well, not necessarily a psychiatrist, but perhaps a psychologist or counselor. You have always demonstrated a remarkable ability to understand and connect with people's emotions. That could be a great advantage in this field." I was silent for a moment, considering the idea. A therapist. Someone whose job was to listen, understand, and help people deal with their emotions. Someone who could use empathy as a tool without arousing suspicion. "I think I like that idea," he finally said. And so, my path was set. I graduated high school and enrolled in a college with a strong psychology program. The years that followed were a mix of challenge and discovery. The academic part was fascinating. I learned about different theories of the human mind, mental disorders, and treatment methods. But the most interesting thing for me were the practical classes, where we had the chance to do simulated counseling sessions with our peers. It was during these sessions that I really began to understand the power and responsibility that came with my abilities. I could feel my clients' true emotions, even when they tried to hide them. I could tell when they were being honest and when they were avoiding the truth. But I also learned the importance of not relying solely on these perceptions. I learned to ask questions, to listen carefully, to guide people to their own discoveries, rather than simply telling them what I knew they were feeling. It was a delicate balance, using my abilities without revealing their true nature. There were times when I was tempted to tell a colleague exactly what I was feeling, to help them overcome an emotional block, but I always held back, reminding myself that my role was to guide them to their own discoveries, not to do the work for them. During my senior year of college, I had the opportunity to do an internship at a local mental health clinic. It was there that I really began to understand the impact I could have on people's lives. I clearly remember one patient in particular, a woman named Maria. She had come to the clinic with complaints of anxiety and depression, but from the moment I saw her, I could sense there was something deeper going on. During our sessions, always supervised by a licensed therapist, I could feel waves of fear and shame emanating from Maria. The emotions were so intense that sometimes I had to take a break to collect myself. Slowly, over the course of several weeks, I was able to guide Maria to talk about the abuse she had suffered as a child. It was a painful process, but at the same time liberating for her. Seeing the change in her emotions, feeling the relief and hope beginning to replace the fear and shame, was one of the most rewarding experiences of my life. It was at that moment that I was sure I had chosen the right path. I could use my skills to really make a difference in people's lives, even if they never knew the full extent of what I could realize. But with this certainty also came a weight of responsibility. I had access to information that my colleagues didn't have. I could feel things that others couldn't. How to use this ethically? How could I ensure I wasn't invading people's privacy or unduly influencing them? These questions accompanied me throughout my education and remain with me to this day. Each session with a client is an exercise in balance, using my skills to guide and support, but always respecting the ethical limits of my profession. It had been several years since my first near-death experience, and I thought it would be a once-in-a-lifetime occurrence. I was mistaken. At age 30, I had another experience that once again changed my perspective on life, death, and the purpose of our existence. It was an ordinary day at work. I was in my office getting ready to receive the next patient when I suddenly felt a sharp pain in my chest. At first, I thought it was just stress. After all, being a therapist is not an easy job, especially with my unique skills. But the pain only increased, and I soon realized that something was very wrong. I barely had time to call for help before I collapsed to the floor. The last thing I remember is hearing alarmed voices and the distant sound of a siren. And then, it happened again. That familiar feeling of being pulled out of my body, the tunnel of light, the feeling of absolute peace. But this time it was different. There were no golden doors waiting for me. Instead, I found myself facing a presence I can only describe as God. It was not the God I had learned about in the churches I attended throughout my life. It wasn't a bearded father figure sitting on a throne in the clouds. It was an entity of pure light and love, so vast and incomprehensible that my mind could barely process it. Next to me, I noticed the presence of other beings of light. One of them communicated with me, not with words, but directly with my consciousness. Over the centuries, said the being, humans have distorted the truth about the divine. They have created religions and dogmas to control and manipulate each other. But the true essence of what you call God is much simpler and much more deeper than any doctrine could express. I was overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was experiencing. It was as if my entire understanding of the universe was being rewritten in an instant. The divine presence enveloped me, and I felt a love so deep and unconditional that it almost tore me apart. There was no trial, there was no condemnation, just total and complete acceptance. Your mission, continued the being of light, is to share this truth, to show people that divine love knows no bounds, that it is not confined to any particular religion or belief. You have seen beyond the veil, Zane. Now, use this knowledge to bring light to a world that is often lost in darkness. Just like the first time, I felt a reluctance to return. The peace and love I experienced was so complete, so perfect, that the idea of returning to earthly reality seemed almost unbearable. But I knew I had a purpose to fulfill. When I woke up in the hospital days later, I was changed once again. The experience had solidified my understanding of my role in the world. It wasn't just about using my skills to help individuals in my practice. It was about sharing a greater message of universal love and acceptance. Of course, this presented new challenges. How do you share this message without sounding like a lunatic? How do I balance my work as a therapist with this new spiritual mission? And how do we deal with the knowledge that much of what people believe about religion and spirituality is fundamentally wrong? These are questions I still struggle with every day. But now at least I have a clarity of purpose that I previously lacked. Every client I serve, every person I interact with, is an opportunity to share a little of that light I have experienced. And who knows, perhaps little by little, we can create a world where unconditional love and acceptance are not just abstract concepts, but lived realities for everyone. Today, at 34 years old, I look back and see the long way I have come since that fateful day when I was 9 years old. The near-death experience I had shaped every aspect of my life in ways I never could have predicted. My office in Seattle is a place of healing for many. People come to me with their pain, their fears, their hopes. And I do my best to help them, using not only the knowledge I have acquired over the years, but also the unique skills I possess. But it's not always easy. There are days when the weight of emotions I absorb from my clients seems almost unbearable. Days when I question if I'm doing the right thing, if I shouldn't just tell the truth about what I can do. And then there are the dreams. They never stopped completely. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night sweating, with visions of future events that I cannot avoid. It's a huge responsibility, knowing things that haven't happened yet. I often wonder if I should try to intervene, to change the course of events. But then I remember the words of that light presence. There are no wrong choices here. Every path leads to growth and understanding. There is also loneliness. Despite being surrounded by people every day, having friends and colleagues who respect me and care about me, there is a part of me that always feels isolated, a part that carries a secret that cannot be completely shared. I have tried a few times over the years to tell the truth to people close to me. My parents, a few close friends, even 1 or 2 professional colleagues I trusted. Reactions ranged from polite skepticism to genuine concern for my mental health. Nobody really understood. How could they? And so, I continue my journey, balancing between 2 worlds. The physical world, with its everyday joys and sorrows, and the spiritual world that I glimpsed in that brief moment between life and death. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my office at the end of a long day, I close my eyes and try to reconnect with that sense of peace and unconditional love that I experienced during my NDE. It's like a lighthouse guiding me through difficult times, reminding me of the greater purpose behind it all. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if I'll ever return to that place of light, if I'll have the chance to choose one of those golden doors. But I know that for now, my place is here. Helping, healing, trying to make a difference. One client at a time. And who knows? Maybe one day I'll find someone who really understands. Someone who has been through something similar. Until then, I continue my journey, grateful for the second chance I've been given and determined to make the best use of it. Because in the end, that's what it's all about, isn't it? To use our experiences, however extraordinary they may be, to make the world a little better place. And that's what I try to do, every day. This is my story. A story of death and rebirth, of pain and healing, of mystery and purpose. A story that is still being written, with each new day, with each new client, with each new dream.